Hello everyone and welcome back, it's Zakiziel here, and I'll be reacting to Mistakes of the Emperor number 3, LORGAR by Old Man Reacts. As always, I highly recommend that you check out his channel. He makes wonderful content, and the last thing I reacted to from him, which was about Goj Van Dyer, was especially entertaining. As are all of the episodes when the Sister Hospitaller shows up, especially since he put a little ferret head on her. And there'll be a link to the original video in the description box below. And without further ado, let's see what he has to say about the runt of the Primarchs, the sycophant, Lorgar Aurelian.
Rescind my previous looped broadcast. Replace it with this. Lorgard of Colchis, you may consider the following. 1. I entirely withdraw my previous offer of solemn ceasefire. It is cancelled and will not be made again, to you or to any other of your motherless bastards. 2. You are no longer any brother of mine. I will find you, I will kill you, and I will hurl your toxic corpse into hell's mouth.
You've chosen the path of pain!
In 798 M30, when the Emperor's flagship set out from Terra alongside his fleet.
I was not expecting Alex Jones. There's so many hilarious things you can make out of his insanity.
It put actions to words to start the Great Crusade to reunite humanity. The Emperor was already being hailed as the greatest of all men, and secretly some whispered that he was much more than just a man. But he dismissed such rumors vehemently. What is true about him is at the time of the Great Crusade, the Emperor was either nearing or slightly over 30,000 solar years in age. We all know this as fact, and your Commissar is not insulting your intelligence, but what I am doing is continuing to lay reinforcement on the framework of my theory on the Emperor himself. In this particular instance, his age. Why is that so important, and why would I bring it up in particular now, in light of today's subject, Lorgar?
Well, considering that the Emperor's been around for either, or at least, or almost 30,000 years by that point in time, then yeah, it's a case of the Emperor's been around for an extremely long time. And well, given the whole thing of him being a perpetual, it's also a case where it's like both him being a perpetual, being that old, and being as powerful a psyker as he is, it's like, even if he's not a god, it's like you could cut someone some slack for thinking he's one. There's people who have done less that have gotten worshipped as gods.
30,000 years, or in smaller numbers, 12,000 generations of humanity had lived and died while the Emperor walked. Imagine living while the world around you burns in the fires of war, plague, political, and religious unrest. Take 40K's lifespan since 1987, 34 years. Black Monday, Iran-Contra, the Berlin Wall, Desert Storm, the USSR falling apart, the formation of the EU, cloning, Kosovo, the International Space Station, 9/11, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, the Great Recession, Deepwater Horizon, the God Particle, the flyby of Pluto, dozens of hurricanes, earthquakes, and typhoons, 2020, and the most horrific of all, Bieber fever.
Honestly, I would call the people who likes Justin Bieber Chaos Cult, considering the lengths that some of those girls are going to just to snap a photo together with him. I know about well, I don't know how big it was, but that whole scandal where it was like they're paying like, was it like, I think it was like $50 each, and they were supposed to be like actually hang out with him, but they just got shepherded in by his security guards. Took a quick snapshot with him, and then he pushed them off to go and have the next picture with the next person. It's like, well, hope the $50 is worth it.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
That is an extremely short list of major events. The Emperor has been through that almost 900 times over. What sort of mentality does that experience breed? What sort of actions would that depth of experience warrant? It is my personal mantra that any opinion that cannot be defended without dismissing other key facts isn't an opinion worth having or even speaking about. This brings me to Lorgar. There are multiple things about Lorgar himself that bear
You're eating the word of Lorgar.
the question that always seems to start with, why did the Emperor X? This, more than Angron, will be the first real test of my assertion of the Emperor's nature, and of course it has to be Lorgar, because of course it would be. In the grand scheme of things, it all begins with Lorgar, and no, I am not talking about the raising of Monarchia in the first place. I am talking far before that. Because the first question that should be asked, even though it's not usually asked at all, is this. Why did the Emperor not kill Lorgar within days of meeting him? When the Emperor was planning the Primarch project, he made each of the Primarchs radically different from the others, sometimes directly specializing roles that the Primarchs would fill after the conquering of the galaxy. For instance, Dorne's Imperial Fists were always going to wind up being those who specialized in fortifying the Imperium once it was taken. Magnus the Red was most certainly going to be tasked with the maintaining of the Imperial Webway, and it's not a far cry to say that his Thousand Sons Legion would have been tasked with defending it from the possible predations of the warp. The Alpha Legion would have been the Secret Police, and the Raven Guard right alongside of them. So on and so on. Lorgar was meant to be the diplomat, while at the same time being Magnus's backup to manage the Webway. Lorgar's purpose, regardless of my being right or wrong about his post-heresy future, was ruined. It was not exactly the planet that he landed on, nor Cor Ferron as many would believe, but it was Lorgar's own nature that led to his eventual destruction. The Emperor's nature has been the topic of this series, but to understand Lorgar, to truly understand Lorgar, understand the following. Lorgar's personality matches the Emperor's in all but 3 regards: accountability, confidence, and self-delusion. In every other way, were one to place Lorgar and the Emperor side by side, they would match up on any given personality test. These flaws, it is my assertion, were not simply personality flaws, they were engineered to be a part of Lorgar's emotional makeup by the Emperor himself. This may seem strange, but it is actually nothing new. Several of the Primarchs held very specific emotional dispositions that either formed them into the paragons or nightmares of the planet that they landed on. Kurz would be the best example of this outside of Lorgar himself. Conrad Kurz wanted to bring order. In fact, order and justice were at the core of his being. In both Conrad and Lorgar's cases, however, their natural tendencies became vastly warped by 2 things: the planet that they landed on, and the people who formed their early lives.
And don't forget, in the case of Conrad Kurz, his weird visions he kept getting. But yeah, if it weren't for that, he would have basically been in charge of, well, basically keeping law and order within the Imperium. It's supposed to be I don't know, would it be like the head of the Supreme Court or something similar?
Conrad had no one to teach him about the subtle nature that justice must have for it not to be injustice. There was no one to teach him that order can be brought about without tyranny. He knew what a crime was almost instinctively, but what turned Conrad Kurz into the Night Haunter was the application of justice without mercy or understanding. For the longest time, a woman who stole food to feed her starving children was the same as a murderer in Conrad's eyes. Both were criminals, and both needed to be punished. Once the Emperor came to Nostromo, and once Conrad began to learn that there was another way, he eventually began to lose the battle for his sanity that had been waged in his mind. Conrad was plagued by visions of the future, visions that ultimately he would bring to pass by his own actions. That, coupled with the fact that Conrad could no longer look at what he'd done for years on his home planet as justified, eventually destroyed the Primarch, leading him down a road of self-destruction.
Yep, and that's And that's also part why the whole madness with the Night Haunter came up, because it's like he couldn't really bear the guilt of what he had done after realizing that there were other ways and that he just never were conceived to think to try them. So he developed, if I remember correctly, he developed the Night Haunter then by that point as almost like an alternate personality, so that he could pin all the blame for his deranged actions on it in order to be able to cope with all the guilt.
Lorgar, on the other hand, was not affected by a lack of supervision and guidance. When he landed on Colchis, a highly religious world to begin with, he was found by nomadic tribesmen, who were in turn promptly killed by the man who Lorgar would call his foster father. This man, Corferon, was a power-hungry opportunist who had been expelled from the capital city of his faith because of his belligerent stance toward the spreading of his church. What gods did the church worship? Well, I'll give you 5 guesses, but you'll only need 4. And no, for all you screaming Malal right now, this is not fucking canon! In Lorgar, Corferon saw a chance not to nurture and teach, but to control. Corferon was both emotionally and physically abusive towards Lorgar. Yes, Corferon abused Lorgar, and Lorgar, despite easily being able to kill Corferon, never raised a hand to him. In fact, the abuse was so severe that some of Corferon's troops mutinied against him, because they refused to beat Lorgar for what was some minor transgression by all accounts. Lorgar, instead of siding with his defenders or even remaining impassive, actually attacked those who were trying to protect him, killing them all. With this in mind, I will return back to my earlier statement. Lorgar was the same as the Emperor in all but 3 regards: accountability, confidence, and self-delusion. At every turn in Lorgar's story, these 3 deficiencies formed the core of why Lorgar turned out the way he did. Corferon identified these personality flaws very early on and used them to devastating effect. It did not matter that Corferon was beating him, or having others beat him. It didn't matter that Corferon was emotionally abusive and dismissive of Lorgar's own budding beliefs.
Basically, Corferon was like that narcissistic parent, and that just fucks up your entire development.
It doesn't matter what you think!
This is not a case of what we call Stockholm Syndrome, where a captive develops an emotional attachment to their captor. At any point when Corferon was hitting Lorgar, Lorgar could have simply falcon punched Corferon into a suborbital trajectory, and both Lorgar and Corferon knew that. What mattered was that Lorgar, in the end, needed to be a follower. Not because he didn't have the confidence to lead, but because in the end he needed 2 things. 1. Lorgar needed someone to blame, and 2. Lorgar needed to be seen. Lorgar's ego demanded that he be at the center of attention, but at the same time Lorgar did not want to be the man sitting in the throne. He never wanted to be that man. He wanted to be the man standing at the throne's left hand, there to reap all the praise and glory alongside the throne, but never there to accept any of the responsibility. This disposition makes for a very capable diplomat, but after landing on Colchis, these same personality traits were going to form a far different and far more dangerous profession. Despite Corferon's manipulations, Lorgar had already begun to win followers among his own growing faith, the belief in the one god. Lorgar had often had visions of a warrior in bronze armor arriving on Colchis accompanied by a one-eyed giant in blue robes, and naturally, due to the heavily religious nature of the planet, this is all translated into a faith all unto its own. The belief that the One would unite the Four. Initially, Corferon had fought against this, often with abuse, but after the mutiny of Corferon's troops, he fell into line behind Lorgar. This may seem to contradict what I said earlier, but it does not. Lorgar was, for the lack of a better term, religious by this point. It seems very unlikely in the extreme that there were many atheists on Colchis, but now that religious fervor, coupled with his visions of what he believed to be the one god, began to turn into good old-fashioned fanaticism. Lorgar began preaching of the one god to the masses, in effect becoming this new god's prophet, standing at the right hand but blameless to his followers. After all, if your followers believe that God wills that a city burn with every man, woman, and child inside, mainly because you told them that's what the God wanted, then it's not you committing the act, it's you following the will of a higher power. Eventually, his following, the Brotherhood of Lorgar, split from the main church of Colchis, and what followed was a brutal holy war called the Schism Wars that eventually involved the entire population of the planet. This is where the true danger of Lorgar's mindset comes into full view, and this is where the line between the Primarch and the Emperor becomes the most apparent. The Emperor sought to unite humanity and resorted to ruthless tactics to achieve his goal. There was no negotiation that was going to be made in the face of the basic demands of the Emperor's Imperium, but there was often a good deal of diplomacy. It was not a common thing for an attack to be ordered straight away during the course of the Great Crusade, often seen as a matter of grave concern if it were known to happen. There were a fair amount of wars to achieve compliance, but it was seldom that they were waged maliciously, and finally, at the end of the day, all the blame landed on the shoulders of the Emperor himself. The Schism Wars were a far different matter, with Lorgar massacring cities who stood against him. It is an easy estimation that Lorgar killed upwards of a third of the population of the planet in both the conquering of it in the name of the one god, as well as the purges of the disbelievers that followed. This is the distinct difference between the Emperor and Lorgar. The Emperor ordered the deaths of billions in the name of reuniting humanity, but only if needed, and only the religious who refused to retract in the face of repeated attempts at reason were put to the sword. The Emperor also shouldered the responsibility for these actions himself. Lorgar ordered the same in the name of his god, and there was no chance for retraction, but Lorgar was never to blame for the horrific atrocities he committed. Not to the eyes of his followers, no, because he was doing them for his god and not for himself.
You know, that also makes that whole thing that happened where he tried to usurp Horus and then got it and got his ass handed to him immediately. And Horus telling him to stand and fight while he just stayed on the ground begging for forgiveness. Yeah, that makes that whole thing actually make a lot more sense to me now.
Note my sarcasm in this. To be absolutely perfectly clear, the only time the Emperor acted in war the same as Lorgar did is when the Emperor was dealing with Xeno-empires. After the conclusion of the Schism War and the purges that followed, Lorgar proclaimed that the one god would arrive within a year, which the Emperor did, coming down to land on Colchis with Magnus at his side, fulfilling Lorgar's prophecy of the future. When the Emperor first...
Actually, even if I remember correctly, even then, like, regarding when the Emperor had those wars with Xeno's empires, that was after Xeno's empires had established a precedent of betraying humanity. So, if I remember correctly, as far as the Emperor was concerned, the aliens wronged humans first.
Met Lorgar, Lorgar immediately knelt and embraced him as a god, and continued to do so even as the Emperor denied his divinity. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the Emperor denied his divinity multiple times to Lorgar, which Lorgar only took as further proof that the Emperor was divine.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
What kind of crack-headed bullshit is that? I wish my bank would tell me I was a billionaire, and as much as I denied saying I was a billionaire, they just kept on throwing money at me until I was a billionaire.
That actually reminds me of this whole thing where with this guy going, I'm not the Messiah, and he's like, they're like, oh, and everyone's going, oh, he denies his divinity, such humility, clearly he's the Messiah, or something like that.
That would make me really fucking happy. I'm just saying. The celebration on Colchis lasted for what was said to be months, with the Emperor frequently showing his disapproval of the religion of the world, which just so happened to be worshipping him. In fact, the Emperor was so forceful in showing his disapproval to Lorgar that the fanatical Primarch actually began to hide his faith. And eventually, despite the Emperor's misgivings, he gave command of the Imperial Heralds to LORGAR. A legion, ironically enough, whose stated goal was to remove the taint of religion from the galaxy at large while unifying humanity. LORGAR was obsessed with either hearing himself talk or having others read his words, and in the early days after he joined the Great Crusade he penned several works that were harshly critical of religion at large. But he remained completely silent on the nature of his father. The converting of his legion came in the form of one whispered word at a time and careful assignment placements to lose Terra-born legionnaires by pure attrition, replacing them with Colchissian stock who were already well indoctrinated. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was a carefully planned out and orchestrated series of events that LORGAR himself set into motion in order to slowly convert the entirety of his legion into his religion. This was not a slapdash operation or just an overly devoted worshipper spreading the good news of the faith. It was a coordinated dance of events to change the spiritual makeup of a legion without attracting outside attention. We're going to stop there for a few moments to consider one very important question that outside of context makes no sense. It was clear to anyone with a pulse that upon showing up on Colchis, the planet itself as well as the Primarch were extremely religious. To someone such as the Emperor, the fact that LORGAR was a fanatic would have been readily apparent. The Emperor's stated goal of the Crusade was to unite all of humanity under an atheistic government. So why would the Emperor not only allow LORGAR to live, but also allow him to recruit directly from the highly religious population of Colchis? The answer to that is based completely on the information at hand, and the answer is darker than you probably would think. There are several things worth noticing throughout the early days of the Word-Bearers. The first is that LORGAR stopped worshipping the Emperor openly, taking his beliefs private until the quiet conversions had reached a point where he could openly worship again in his own ranks. It was only then that the pace of the Word-Bearers in the Crusade began to slow, as once the majority of the Word-Bearers had been converted, then LORGAR could easily explain why he was lingering to those who would then convert the worlds they conquered. The Word-Bearer Legion slowed their pace of conquest to an absolute crawl, achieving not Imperial compliance, but LORGAR's version of Imperial compliance. The Emperor knew very well what was going on. Reports came in from first the Word-Bearers and then outside of the Word-Bearers that were actively informing the Emperor about the changes within the 17th Legion. Anyone who focuses on the lore surrounding the Unifications Wars as well as the Great Crusades know very well the Emperor was set on completely disbanding religion in its entirety. But for some reason, a reason I will soon go into, the Emperor was content for the time being to allow LORGAR to continue with his worship. So why was it allowed in the first place? Why did not only the Emperor allow LORGAR to live, but also give him a full legion to have the opportunity to spread his face to the stars beyond Colchis? On the outside, this makes little to no sense, but as I have stated several times already in this series, context is everything, and for this decision, context is needed. The reason behind the Emperor allowing LORGAR to live has nothing to do with LORGAR himself, the Primarch of the 17th Legion. However, it has everything to do with the Imperium's attitudes before the Emperor met LORGAR, with the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, and most importantly an event known as the Rangdan Genocides. All that is known about the 2nd and 11th Legions is that they were still around by 930 M31, from perhaps the only lasting record of their legions participating in the Rangdan Genocides. Imperial records have been completely purged of all other information surrounding the two legions and their Primarchs. The only evidence that they existed to begin with comes from a single line in the Guardsman's uplifting primer and a few ancient plinths that stand empty. What is known is that sometime between 930 M31 and 964 M31, all traces of the existence of the 2nd and 11th were nearly wiped out, and the event was traumatic even to the Emperor himself. It is known that Leman Russ and his legion were involved, but it is not actually clear when this happened. The timeline of events is not clear to say the least. Between the 2nd and 11th Primarch, however, shame is only placed seemingly on the 2nd, while the 11th is not mentioned in these terms in the few lines of dialogue and personal musings on the two Primarchs in the lore. What is clear is that whenever it did occur, it was still very fresh in everyone's mind. Whatever occurred was severe enough that even Sanguinius was concerned about bringing a genetic flaw within the Blood Angel's legion to his father, for fear that it would result in the destruction of his legion and himself. What can be implied is a genetic mutation similar in nature destroyed at least one of the legions, and from the words of Belisarius' call, we can infer that the Primarch was ultimately responsible. The fates of these two legions and their Primarchs answer a few very pressing questions. The first is why Lorgar was allowed to live in the first place. Due to the information in the lore, it was known that Lorgar was met by the Emperor only a few years before the beginning of the Ragdan Genocides. While the meeting between the Emperor went well from the standpoint of the Emperor, with Lorgar eventually not speaking of him as a god anymore, at least openly, it still left a good deal on the Emperor's mind. The extermination of a legion was not even a thing to be considered, and while Lorgar's religious tendencies were a problem for the Emperor, the concept of killing one of his own creations was clearly not on his mind. Whatever course of action the Emperor would have taken regarding Lorgar's religious tendencies was completely interrupted by the Ragdan Genocides. The Ragdan...
Also, not to mention that given how the Emperor, what happened regarding Angron, the Emperor also probably didn't want to lose very many Primarchs because he needed them for the Great Crusade, which is also part of why I assume that the Emperor waited until Lorgar's progress slowed to an extreme crawl before he actually stepped in and really did anything about it.
Genocides can easily be considered the second most destructive war in Imperial history, with only the Horus Heresy itself surpassing it, and even then it's only an estimation. It involved the forces of 7 legions, and is known that 3 legions brought their entire strength to bear. Several dozen Titan legions were obliterated, and during the 3rd campaign alone, nearly 50,000 Space Marines were killed in a single battle. Entire human inhabited sectors were cleansed of life. The Dark Angels, having recently discovered their Primarch, were at a strength of 100,000 legionnaires by the war's start, but at the end they were under 10,000. The Death Guard was so depleted that their Primarch Mortarion actually authorized emergency acceptance of recruits that did not come from his homeworld of Barbaros, something that he simply did not do on principle. The Space Wolves were likewise extremely depleted, but numbers or facts about how extremely are not apparent. During this time is when the Dark Angels obviously ceded the title of the largest legion, and they ceded it to the Ultramarines for reasons that are obvious, yet still hold a bit of mystery. And it is also in Horus Lupercal, who was occupied far away from the Genocides, rapidly ascended in the eyes of his fellows. For decades afterwards, the crusade would slow as multiple legions, Titan legions, and the God Emperor alone knows how many guardsmen needed to recuperate from the losses sustained. Even some of the Space Marines who had participated in the war were so affected by the war that they were rotated away from frontline service. Take a moment and consider that. Many Space Marines were so affected by this they could no longer participate in war.
Wow, it sounds like the fighting must have been absolutely horrendous then.
The only time the number of Astartes dead would even be rivaled would be during the Istvan V drop site massacre, where 3 full legions were nearly wiped out, and even then it is up to speculation, as we do not have solid numbers of the dead in the Genocides, as most of the records are sealed or redacted. It was either during or after the Genocide that the 2nd and 11th legions were wiped out. After the loss of the 2nd and 11th, it was no longer considered impossible for a legion to attack another legion, or for a Primarch to kill another Primarch, even though the thought of it was still clearly unthinkable to the legions that were not present. Even after what befell the 2nd and 11th, an Ultramarine was censored for theoretically proposing a scenario where Astartes fought Astartes. What is clear is that the fate of the 2nd and 11th was forbidden to speak of by the Emperor himself, and it was an order that even heretic Astartes that lived during that time still follow. It was due to these conflicts that the nature of the Emperor's interaction with Lorgar changed completely, as well as his relationships with his other sons, who now knew that the Emperor would order the destruction of a legion if the situation was considered dire enough. It is almost worth saying that the road to the Horus Heresy did not begin near a destroyed city called Monarchia. It actually started with the Ragdan Genocides. So now we come back to the first question I sought to answer. Why did the Emperor allow Lorgar to live in the first place? I said the answer to that was a dark one, and it is this. It is my belief that after the Emperor had seen the religious fervor displayed in Lorgar, the Emperor had no intention on him surviving the Great Crusade. Lorgar's personality had been tailor-made to fill a specific role within the Imperium, that of an ambassador and diplomat, but the aspect of religion as well as the influence of Kor Pharon had twisted those same personality traits in a far different direction, turning Lorgar into a zealot. By the time Lorgar met the Emperor, he had become a complete fanatic, and in the face of that, the Emperor knew well that he had no real recourse unless Lorgar himself changed. The Emperor viewed his sons as tools, and Lorgar was supposed to be a flat-tipped screwdriver with a soft foam grip, meant to gently drive the point home and make life painless for everyone. Instead, Lorgar was a book of hymnals. Well, at least it still functions as a hammer, at least for a little while.
I have the power of God and anime on my side! Wait,
Lorgar could stop saying he worshipped the Emperor, but even then the Emperor knew full well that he still did. It is my belief that the Emperor had decided to roll the dice with Lorgar, giving his zealous son a chance to change, and if not, there was another more final option he had in store. During the Unification Wars, the backbone of the Emperor's military forces were genetically modified super soldiers known as the Thunder Warriors.
Ah, yes.
The Thunder Warriors were actually stronger, faster, and more combat capable than the Space Marines who replaced them, but they were far less stable in both temperament and genetics.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, sometimes they just kind of die because some stuff just went wrong with their biology.
It is an Imperial legend that during the last battle of the Unification Wars, the Thunder Warriors died to the last man on the slopes of Mount Ararat, fighting the enemies of the Emperor. The only accurate bit of information in that legend is that the Thunder Warriors died. One of the greatest lies in Imperial history covers up a horrific truth, that the Emperor of Mankind repaid the Thunder Warriors by ordering his personal guard, the Adeptus Custodes, to destroy them all as they had fulfilled their purpose. Of all the genetically modified Thunder Warriors who fought and died for the Emperor, only a few are known to have lived from the genocide of their entire genetic strain. It is a truth that if it came out, would have meant almost immediate civil war. The Emperor had taken an inconvenience and turned that inconvenience into a tale of sacrifice and loyalty that had endured. If he had done it once, there was no reason he wouldn't have done it again. But if this was truly the decision he was going to make, it was interrupted entirely by the Ragdan Genocides. By the time the wars were over and the Emperor had a chance to follow up on the reports that he had been receiving regarding the actions of his son Lorgar, there were 2 destroyed legions, 3 that were depleted beyond half strength, several more that needed to recuperate from serious losses, and scores of other military forces that had been either outright destroyed or needed to replenish over half their strength. The Great Crusade at that point was only being pressed forward by the human expedition fleets and the remaining legions that simply did not engage in the genocides, one of which was Lorgar's. In the face of this, the Emperor could simply no longer afford to allow the snail's crawl of Lorgar's legion to continue. It was in the aftermath of all of this that the Emperor called Robute Guilliman to his side, who now controlled the largest legion in the Imperium, and set off to the world of Kur and the city of Monarchia. When most are introduced to what happened at Monarchia, the most common reaction is bewilderment, simply because it's the first time that you're meeting many of these characters in the lore. As the Ultramarines had the 500 worlds of Ultramar, the Wordbearers also had their little pocket empire, and its crown jewel was Monarchia. It was a city purely devoted to the worship of the Emperor, and many Wordbearers considered it the perfect city. A fleet arrived in the orbit of planet Kur, and the Ultramarines deployed in full Legion strength against the city in what can only be called a planetary assault drop. They were accompanied by members of the Emperor's personal guard, the Custodes. The occupied city of Monarchia was easily taken, and the Ultramarines herded the population out of the city. Many civilians were killed in the process as they rioted against the orders. Once a certain time frame had been reached, the civilian population was out of the city, and the fleet in orbit opened fire, destroying Monarchia completely. It was only then that the civilian population of Kur was allowed to send a message to the Wordbearers. From the outside, this looks absolutely out of character for both the Emperor and the Ultramarines in particular.
Yeah, and given in the mention of how for the Wordbearers, Monarchy was the perfect city. Yeah, so So for the word bearers, the burning of Monarchia would be the equivalent of if Ultramar got put to the torch, or well, more like what happened and for the Thousand Suns, where Tizca got put to the torch.
Ultramarines were known for their absolute iron discipline, and yet they opened fire on civilians who had at best been throwing pottery at them in completely understandable fear and anxiety. What's clear in the interactions between the Ultramarines and some of the civilians is they were unhappily following orders that Gilliman himself was none too happy to issue. These orders to open fire on the civilians who resisted the evacuation order came from the Emperor himself. Once again, it's time for context. To any who think the Ultramarines wouldn't fire on a civilian population, I invite you to think again. They most definitely would, and their tally of compliances confirms it. They may not have enjoyed the orders, and the writing supports that they did not, but it was far less harsh than it could have been. Evidence of this comes from the dialogue between a young woman named Cyrene and a Thunderhawk pilot who tries to reason with her to do what she's been asked to do, and only losing patience when she continues to call the Emperor a god. The population had been openly fighting the presence of the Ultramarines, but the crackdown had been equally harsh. In truth, the city was in a de facto state of rebellion against the edicts of the Imperial Truth, and completely out of the borders of Imperial compliance. Also realize that if Lorgar had not landed on Colchis itself, the Emperor would have most likely had it scoured of life, considering the nature of the religion that existed there. That includes killing civilians. A lot of them.
Yeah, it could have been worse. They could have just exterminated the entire planet.
The fact the Emperor ordered the evacuation at all was a mercy, considering how organized and open religions were usually treated. But it is a mercy that many forget was a mercy at all. Remember, this was a message not targeted at the civilians of Kur. It was a message targeted clearly at the word-bearers. The city's destruction also needs to be put into context. This was the Emperor's final warning to Lorgar, and he needed to be shown the results. It is clear from the lore that the Emperor tried to reason with him more than once, but Lorgar refused to be swayed before this incident. The Emperor needed to show where Lorgar's path would lead in a way that would brook no further argument. The destruction of Lorgar's perfect city, a city architecturally designed for the purpose of the glorification of the Emperor as a god, was the example. When the word bearers broke warp, they came in ready to fight, but not knowing who they were going to be fighting. When the civilian leadership sent their distress call, they had identified the Ultramarines as their attackers. The concept of fighting another legion stole the thunder from the word bearers, and they were stunned when they were ordered to assemble in full legion strength in the ashes of Monarchia. When Lorgar came down, his Stormbird was flanked by several Ultramarine Thunderhawks. No one could miss the fact that the weapons of the Thunderhawks were locked onto the Stormbird of Lorgar. This was not an escort, it was a prisoner transfer.
You going to jail now?
Okay,
You
let's go,
going to
nigga.
jail
Let's go, nigga.
now? You going to jail?
Once the Legion had assembled planetside, they were soon attended by 100 Ultramarines, which many viewed as an insult, and then directly addressed by Malkador the Sigillite, who himself was accompanied by Rabute Gilliman. Malkador tried to reason with the irate Primarch of the Word-Bearers, only to get backhanded for his efforts. Once Malkador recovered enough to speak, he called to the Emperor himself. As the Emperor arrived in a flash of teleportation, he once again tried to reason with Lorgar. And while some criticized the discussion between the Emperor and Lorgar, what was clear to me is the Emperor was tired of making these same points over and over again to his wayward son.
Just tell me how we can something so simple up. Enough's enough. I'm done. All together. Off. Get out. Get out.
In the end, the Emperor set out to do one single thing at Monarchia, and that was to utterly crush Lorgar's faith in front of his legion. He forced the entirety of the Lord-Bearers' Legion to kneel before him in the ashes of their perfect city, and while some of the Word-Bearers railed against this forced subjugation, it came with a point. He told them that of every legion, the Word-Bearers alone had failed him.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
Idiot sandwich what?
An idiot sandwich, Chef Ramsay.
erecting monuments to lies and driving the population of their conquered worlds into a false faith.
Yep. Also, actually, it just kind of occurred to me that regarding when Lorgar backhanded Malcador, given what I've heard that Malcador can do, like the time that he used his psyker powers to do the equivalent of force choking Horus. Whereas, I doubt that Lorgar would have been able to do much if Malcador or had actually decided to fight back, even if he is a Primarch.
He told them that this was the end that they were heading towards, and the meaning to everyone should have been obvious. This was the final warning. There would be no more discussion. The impact of the Emperor's words was more destructive than the bombardment of the city itself. As the Emperor teleported back into orbit, Lorgar was left facing his brother on the planet below and lashed out at the Primarch of the Ultramarines, accusing him of drawing satisfaction from seeing his legion shamed. When Guilliman denied this, saying Lorgar was over-imaginative, Lorgar shrugged Guilliman with his Crozius hammer. This was the first time that either legion had seen a Primarch attack another Primarch, as neither of them had been there for what happened to the 2nd and 11th Legion. The entirety of the Wordbearer's Legion, before Guilliman had even hit the ground, were training their bolters on the Ultramarines. And the 100 Ultramarines had their bolters trained right back at them. Both sides were in disbelief at what was transpiring. But several Wordbearers recalled, wishing that someone had actually started firing. This was not in itself signs of early chaos corruption in the Wordbearers. This is just a simple and natural reaction to the events transpiring in front of them. In the end, Lorgar had misjudged Guilliman, for in truth Guilliman did not even want to be there. For all of the talk that Guilliman and the Emperor had planned this activity together, there is very little evidence whatsoever that Guilliman had anything to do with the planning of this event.
Or that really he had any say in it, from what's been said thus far. It really just looks like the Emperor, well, more like Guilliman just happened to be the one who was sent to do this, because his legion happened to be the largest at the time.
Guilliman himself was not comfortable with the idea of shaming a legion, and much less comfortable with his legion being used in the process, and this bothered him for years. The Emperor wanted the Primarch of the Ultramarines there as an example for the Wordbearers to set themselves to, but wound up placing a target on the backs of the Knights of Ultramar that would eventually be shot at in the second great betrayal of the Horus Heresy at the Battle of Calth. The situation rapidly defused as Lorgar's anger bled away, replaced by the shame of what had just happened. The Wordbearers returned to their ships to lick their wounded pride, further wounded now that they knew that they would be accompanied by a force of custodes to watch their actions and report back to the Emperor. While they were not around for what happened to the 2nd and 11th Legion, the Wordbearers were well aware of what Monarchia meant for them as a legion, and so did Lorgar. Lorgar's faith was completely shattered, as was his legion, but as the Wordbearers went back into orbit, the only true mistake the Emperor made at Monarchia came into effect. Often when people discuss the Horus Heresy, they bring up Monarchia as a prime example of the Emperor's lack of judgment. In truth, in the planning and execution of Monarchia, the Emperor had done exactly what he had set out to do. Lorgar was facing down the truth of what he had done not only to himself and to his legion and the planets they had conquered, but his homeworld. His god had burned his faith away and burned it to ash in such a brutal manner that he was actually facing his errors in judgment. He spitefully recalled the Schism War and how he had burned his homeworld in the name of faith, a faith he now knew in his heart was wronged. If Lorgar was facing this alone, or with another set of company captains, this would have radically altered the future of not only the Wordbearers, but the entire Imperium. The destruction of Monarchia was meant to be brutal. It was meant to be a savage slap to the face of a Primarch and a legion who had not listened to reason. While one can lament the fact that the city, and in fact many other cities on the planet had been leveled, and that the civilian population had suffered, one can also wonder why the Emperor would order such a thing. But it is easy to forget that in its expansion the Word-Bearers themselves had done far worse, as had every other legion in the Crusade. Even the act of forcing the Word-Bearers to kneel in the ashes of the city had a symbolic purpose, as one of the ceremonies of the Word-Bearers was to observe solemn rites in the ashes of cities on worlds that they had conquered. If you want a synonym for conquered in this regard, obliterated.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
The Emperor's mistake in all this was not the destruction of Monarchia, and it was not the humbling of the Word-Bearers, because his actions actually had their intended effect. Lorgar's faith had been utterly crushed, and his legion, while shamed, was well under the will of its Primarch.
I have a feeling that this follows a similar route as what happened with Conrad Kurz, where once Lorgar had to actually face the guilt of what he had done, and he started to look for a way out.
The only mistake the Emperor made at Monarchia, and with Lorgar in general, was not putting a bolt round in the head of Corferon, and not putting a second bolt round in the head of Erebus. It is a joke in 40k to say that Lorgar was at fault for everything, but in absolute truth, at least half of that responsibility falls to Corferon and Erebus. Just when Lorgar was on the verge of overcoming the religious indoctrination that his foster father had put him through, Corferon and Erebus were quick to capitalize on the eviscerated ego that the Emperor had left behind.
Oh boy.
I need to take a break for a few minutes before I continue. It was my firm belief, due to the subject of today's Voxcast, I needed to take certain precautions.
Die, heretic! Die! 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 Burn in holy fire!
Sister Evele, are you enjoying the game?
Yes, Commissar. I thought purging the Xenos was fun in person, but this is a welcome distraction. Did you tell them that you opened a Patreon?
Yes.
Like and subscribe to the Voxcast?
Yes. Do you see those heretics over there?
I see them.
Make them repent, Sister Evele.
Repent, motherfucker!
Alright, Sister Evele, have fun purging the heretics in the name of the Emperor. Unplug this. Unplug this. Okay, now I shouldn't be interrupted. Lorgar, you fucking prick! Lorgar's largest character flaw, by a high measure, was his susceptibility to delusion, and in turn, believing even the most obvious lies about his own nature. He desired to believe the best of himself, and both Corferon and Erebus knew well how to manipulate those flaws. Lorgar could not see the expression that Erebus did on the face of Corferon. Erebus saw Corferon for what he wanted and always has wanted. The hunger for power and the desire to control. All Lorgar's dumbass could see was the delusion. One that Corferon had maintained even if he had beat the shit out of Lorgar as a child on Colchis. Lorgar saw a father who grieved for his son, where only a few minutes ago, Lorgar was looking inwards at his mistakes. Corferon and Erebus just slowly began to guide the Primarch toward a plan that the two of them had laid in wait just for a day like this one, when Lorgar's faith would be ruptured and could be reforged in a new direction. One of the most laughable lies that Corferon told Lorgar, and Lorgar actually fucking believed, is that Lorgar could not commit acts of cruelty with a smile on his face. Bullshit! Lorgar had only come a few hours away in
Heretic Borgar.
truth from reforging himself and his legion. But all of a sudden, the manipulations of Corferon and Erebus, and now the Word-Bearers are on a path of damnation, and the only thing it took was really soft-spoken flattery and appeals to Lorgar's sensitive little ego. While the Emperor had achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve, the lack of
Oh yeah, the Tech Priest and the Omnisci, yeah, so it's... Yeah, so yeah, it's like, actually, the Emperor wasn't, well, out of necessity, he probably didn't do anything about the Mechanicus, but probably if Lorgar hadn't been worshipping the Emperor despite his repeated, corrections that he's not a god, yeah, probably would have turned out different.
Around his son and his legion left him without a singular, critical piece of information.
He's
a very strange young man.
He's an idiot.
Lorgar was a puppet. While not afraid of Corferon or Erebus or in any way physically challenged by them, Lorgar was completely subject to the words and whims of his foster father and was under the thumb of the old priest. The problem was that Lorgar never even fully realized it until far after his fall. Or maybe he actually did realize it, but he was too much of a pussy to actually do anything about it. Or maybe he did realize it, but just didn't want to do anything about it because he could always turn around and be like, "Daddy, you told me that this was good." What a fucking phenomenal prick in any regards. I have no sympathy, no pity, and I just do not give a shit about anybody saying that Lorgar was just a good old boy who was trying to do things the right way. Fuck him, fuck that. When some people read the story of Lorgar and the First Heretic, they don't seem to grasp the full reality of what is happening and the subtlety of the words at play. At no point when I reread the story of Lorgar's fall do I even begin to feel pity for Lorgar or Aurelian. Lorgar's fall was not dictated by the Emperor.
You know, actually, I remember, Old Man mentioned in a video, I think it was about Corferon or Erebus, one of them, that the word bearers themselves had this weird quirk where basically they'd feel compelled to do whatever Lorgar wanted them to do in order to seek his approval. I was kind of wondering if that was just, well, indoctrination, or if that's an actual genetic feature programmed into them because, you know, the genes he's based off of Lorgar's DNA. And if that's the case, then Lorgar basically worshipping the Emperor, that in itself was likely just a natural thing to happen too. Still doesn't excuse him being a brick wall about it and not accepting when the Emperor himself tells him he's not a god.
Because, unpopular opinion, Monarchia was not a mistake of the Emperor at all. The massive casualties of the Rangdan genocides forced the Emperor to take drastic action so the Great Crusade wouldn't stall. In this drastic action, he made an extremely powerful statement, but that statement did not cause Lorgar's fall. The actions of the Emperor did not set Lorgar on the course to chaos. Lorgar's fall was decided because at no point—
Yep, this is the one I was talking about, where he's like, "Will you please listen, I'm not the Messiah," and they're like, "He is the Messiah."
Could the Primarch be honest with himself? He would look for any way out, any excuse, and grab hold of it to keep the truth at bay. Even in the present age of the Imperium, Lorgar continues to hold on to his faith and fanaticism to distract himself from the truth. That truth that the Emperor revealed to him in Monarchy in such a way it shattered a zealot's faith. Lorgar was not the kind, gentle, and loving soul that he had allowed himself to be convinced that he was through endless amounts of bullshit. He was not a merciful lord who could not commit atrocity with a smile on his face. He was
Imagine being that word bear like you've been alive for 10,000 years, literal champion of chaos, and some titanium ball that comes charge to get you screaming his lungs off, holding a primed melta grenade.
Never interested in the truth at all. He was never interested in the betterment of mankind and a hope of a better tomorrow. He was neither a poet, a scholar, or a visionary. He was not possessed of unshakable loyalty or devotion. He never genuinely cared for humanity. He was never a dreamer, and the last thing he ever approached being was introspective. Lorgar was a weak-willed, genocidal zealot. One who would loudly and vocally lament the decisions he made that brought the galaxy to burn. One who would loudly and visibly proclaim that he never wanted the truth to be like this, but because it was the truth, he just had to pursue it. One who tried to deny his accountability in planning the Horus Heresy when he was the motherfucker who initiated the damn thing. These last three statements are telling, because even the most self-deluded idiot eventually breaks the needle on their own bullshit meter.
Let's see. Conquering countless worlds and exterminating all the former faiths and beliefs according to the Imperial. But then building temples to honor the Emperor and staying on these worlds to enforce it. Backhanding an old man 20 feet into the air because he says your words weren't compliant with the Emperor. Not immediately sacking Erebus when he reveals that he disobeyed orders and allowed old beliefs to survive on your worlds. Forced to kneel before Papa Smurf. You know, actually, that's a good point. And why didn't Erebus just get killed by Lorgar for that? Considering, you know, Lorgar killed plenty of people before for not following the for not following his faith.
And when you strip the sheer acreage of bullshit away from Lorgar, what you're left with is a pathetic, insecure, and disgustingly unworthy Primarch who didn't even have the courage to own up to their own actions. In fact, of all the traitor Primarchs, Lorgar is the only one whose reasons for turning I simply cannot respect in the slightest. Conrad Curse turned because his disposition drove him insane and his latent need for justice demanded he keep going until someone actually truly punish him for his crimes. Magnus the Red turned out of complete and utter necessity to save himself and his legion due to scheming by Horus himself. Perturabo was a man who only truly wished to create, but because of the lot in life he drew, he was only allowed to destroy. He was a Primarch who hated the very military actions that he was actually the best at. And that hatred turned to pure bitterness at the thanklessness of the task he performed. Fulgrim had the very core of his nature perverted by Slaanesh, his arrogance and self-confidence ultimately causing his downfall before he himself even realized he was falling to begin with. Mortarion ultimately had the most sympathetic cause to turn on the Emperor out of all of them besides Angron, and that's because he just simply had more loyalty towards Horus to begin with. Alpharius turned to preserve the Emperor's dream, and in reality, they might not even be traitors in the Alpha Legion. With the Alpha Legion, nothing is certain. I have respect for Angron because he actually had reasons for everything he did. I have none for Lorgar. Lorgar took advantage of Angron's plight to literally turn him into a sacrifice to the Chaos Gods, and for all of his bluster and bullshit, claiming he just wanted to save Angron's life, all of that is complete horseshit. Lorgar did nothing more or less than condemn Angron to an eternity of suffering and hate.
Yep, because Angron just wanted to die.
And for what? The claim that he loved his brother? No, but Lorgar definitely bullshitted himself into believing it, just like he bullshitted himself into believing every other blatant lie he either told himself or what was told about him to cushion his glass ego and boost his fragile self-esteem. You want to know the reason Lorgar did to Angron what he did? He did it not out of love for his brother, but to suck the ass of the Chaos Gods. Well, normally in this series, I'd be putting the decisions of the Emperor on blast or into context. I'm not doing that this time. The Emperor well and truly did nothing wrong on Monarchia, save for not realizing the truth about his son's nature that only his foster father really understood. Lorgar never wanted to lead the heresy. He wanted to give grand speeches in support of the one who did, and be loved and respected for it. And look how well that turned out for him when he's trying to give a speech above Isfahan 5 about what they're doing, and Conrad Curse is literally 4 hours away from telling him that he's the most pathetic coward known to exist. And believe me, Conrad has seen some pathetic shit. His job was to terrify people into pissing their pants and handing over all their family members so he wouldn't turn himself loose on them. Conrad thought Lorgar was more pathetic than that. Lorgar never wanted to be the one to shoulder the responsibility. Never that, blaming anyone else in Reach for the atrocities that he himself had initiated and approved of. He never wanted to be responsible for any decision he had made, blaming the need for the truth, claiming that it was the will of the gods, claiming he must sacrifice anything and everything for the truth, and no matter what the cost, no matter how perverse or horrific, Lorgar would pay it, and gladly. Anything to keep from facing the real truth. The truth that Lorgar has not once been able to accept about himself and still cannot. Lorgar cannot face the fact that he is evil. Evil in its most pure form. That's it. The fucking video is done on Lorgar. Fuck Lorgar. Old man out.
Well, that was entertaining, but also very informative, because I really didn't realize is so much about Lorgar and the burning of Monarchia.
You don't know the things I dream.
Ah, yes, coming up.
No one does. No one ever cared enough to find out.
But yeah, that was very informative and entertaining thing, but like especially informative given actually how little I knew about the whole, well, burning of Monarchia, and Lorgar in general, aside from a few things like, him being the one who wrote the Imperial Truth that says to worship the Emperor, him being incredibly religious, and a few other things. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching with me, and if you did, I'd appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe. And if you aren't already checking out Old Man Reacts content, and I highly recommend that you do so. But that's all for tonight. I wish you all a wonderful night. Bye-bye.